On the top of Daf Gimel Amid Aleph, and we'll start with Misaknin Es Hadrochim, which you'll see on the top line. So we learned in our Mishnah that on the 15th of Adar, despite the fact that it's Purim, certainly in the Krochim, in the big cities, but even all over Israel, we commemorate the 15th of Adar as Purim. Nevertheless, for the sake of tzorchei harabim, that which is to benefit the entire community, we will get involved in malachos, and some of them are serious, heavy malachos. But for the sake of tzorchei harabim, we're allowing asiyas malacha, and that has its precedent in Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed, which is osur b'malacha. Nevertheless, for the sake of tzorchei harabim, the Gemara in Masechet Moed Katan establishes that we're allowed to do malacha necessary for tzorchei harabim even on Chol HaMoed. Elu ein tzorchei harabim, and now we're going to go and stretch our arm out to a brisa in Masechet Moed Katan that delineates exactly what's included in tzorchei harabim, and for the sake of what are we allowed to do malacha on Chol HaMoed, and by analogy during the period of the 15th of Adar. Number one, danin dine momenos. If, let's say, Ruvain has a claim against Shimon, and he feels that he'd like to be judged, even though it's Chol HaMoed, we will judge him. The dine nefashos. Let's say, for example, Beis Din in a capital case issued a verdict of guilty, and the accused was condemned to die. The way the Rambam interprets this, we will put him to death even on Chol HaMoed. And the reason for that is because of what's called Inui Hadin, which is a concept in Masechet Sanhedrin. Dini Makos, so too if someone was condemned in a court that he violated a law that generates malchus, we will implement the malchus even on Chol HaMoed. When a person takes upon himself, for example, erech olai or erech ploni olai, which means that he pledges to the Mikdash to give the value on the market of so-and-so, or his own value. And the same thing is true with regard to charamin, that a person owes Beis Din, or the Gizbar, I should say, a monetary payment of cherem, and pidio of hekdeshos. If, let's say, a person was magdish something, lebedek habayis, now he wants to be podeh, he wants to redeem it, all these evaluations will be implemented even on Chol HaMoed, and again, by analogy, on the 15th of Adar. Mashkim es sota. If a woman was found to be a sota, and now we have to check and to see whether she's guilty or not, we will have her drink from this hashkas meisota, and it'll determine whether or not she will live or die. Also, it has to do with ksuba, whether or not she gets a ksuba or she doesn't get a ksuba. And then the Brisa records sofen as a para, the para duma, the afer of which was used to be mitayar mason from tumas mes. We will do that sreifa of the paraduma on Chol HaMoed, the orphan egla arufa. And if we find a corpse equidistant between two cities, and we do the medida, and then when we determine that the corpse is closer to one city than another, the zkanim of that city will do a ritual which is called egla arufa, and the arifa sa'egla will be implemented even on Chol HaMoed. The rotim Eved Ivri, if an Eved Ivri after 6 years of servitude declares that although I'm allowed to go free, but I don't want to go lo eisei chafshi, then we do what's called ritzia, and we bore a hole in his ear, in his lobe, and that we do even on Chol HaMoed, and he will serve until the Yovel. Mitarin es ha-mitzora, if a mitzora who was tamei with tumas tzaras now through the process of purification comes to bring his karbanos, he's a mechusa kapara until he brings karbanos, And not only that, there's a din of nesinas dam v'shemen al boen yodov v'raglov. This entire process of purification will take place even on Chol Hamoed v'forkim saminol me'al gabi hamayim during the rainy season, when there was an abundance of rainfall, and the rain would be collected in large public cisterns, and there was a fear that people might take advantage of this if it was open and steal water. Water was a very expensive commodity, so they locked up the entranceways into these boros, to these cisterns, during the winter months, so that no one could go in there and embezzle and steal the water. And now, when the end of the winter reached its culmination, and now it's the summer months, and the public needs access to water because these are the dry months of the year, they would open up these minalos, these locks, and and during the entire summer months, these public drinking places, cisterns of water, were accessible to the community, and there was no locking up until the following winter. Now, again, all this takes place tzarchei rabim on Chol Hamoed, and almost with the Kal V'chomer on the 15th of Adar. Keep in mind that Mordechai did not succeed, even though he's trying to persevere, to convince the Anshe Knesset Gedolah to establish Purim as a day of Yisra Malach. But nevertheless, there is a minhag. Not everyone has that minhag to abstain from malacha on Purim, and if that be the case, we want to limit the amount of malacha we do. But for the sake of tzarchei rabim, no holds barred, and we have that list that we saw from the Brisa Masechet Moed Katan. Amon Tanina, in a Mishnah at the beginning of Masechta Moed Katan, as far as Chol Hamoed is concerned, it says Mashkin Beis Hashlochim. Now, this is a different halacha, also relevant to Chol Hamoed, and that is Davar Avud, meaning if a person has a field, and the only way for his crop to grow in that field is by irrigating the field, then we're allowed to irrigate the field on Chol Hamoed, because the crops will die. They cannot subsist on rainwater alone, and will allow this on Chol Hamoed in order to prevent a financial loss. But what we're most interested in is the next part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Umitzaynin al hakvaros, that they set up simonim, which is called tziyun kever, which is a marker that tells the kohanim, or those who are makpid on chulu b'tar, that they should keep away because there's a burial site over here. And they're allowed to do this even on Chol Hamoed. Now, let's take, for example, Chol Hamoed Pesach, Haba Aleinu L'Tova. Why are we setting up these markers on Chol Hamoed? We already did that on the 15th of Adar, as we saw in our Mishnah. So the Gemara asks, Lo kvar tzainu me Adar? Didn't we already, on the 15th of Adar, set up the tziyunei kvarim, which is one of the tzarchei rabim that's listed in our Mishnah that we implement on the 15th of Adar? So why a full month, more than a full month later, you're putting up these markers and overriding Chol Hamoed? Why? So the Gemara answers, V'tiftar, we're going to interpret that Mishnah in Chol Hamoed as a case of Chayorad Shetef Shal Gishamim Ushtafa, that on that particular winter, or it's the end of the winter, but in any event, that season, there was a large, unusually a large quantity, volume of rainwater, and as a result, the sid, if you remember, we discussed yesterday that they put lime around the kever as a marker, and the lime got disintegrated, got washed away by the wind, by the waters. And we desperately needed tziyun kever to protect the kohanim. So we'll allow this on Chol Hamoed. A similar question the Gemara asks from the end of the Mishnah in Moed Katan. It says, V'yotim Af al hakilayim on Chol Hamoed, we will send out the shluchei bezdin to oversee, supervise, and guarantee that there's no kilayim going on in the sodos. So once again, lokvar yotzu me'adar, our Mishnah says that already in the month of Adar, the 15th Adar, we sent out the shluchei bezdin to guarantee that there's no hanky-panky, no one is violating the Yitzhak Kalayim. Why are you doing this on Chol Hamoed? Tipoter shahoisa shana felo. It was a dark year. In other words, it was a limited amount of sunshine on that particular winter, and therefore, einat smochim nikarim, the growth following the planting at that date of the 15th of Adar, the growth was stunted. Bezdin couldn't even find where things were growing. It was such a dark, there's no photosynthesis, there's no sun. And we had to wait until the growth, the vegetation started to produce, so that the Shluchei Bezdin could now check out and see whether there's Kalayim or not. Inayin Litzim, is there a Doraisa, some sort of a pasuk in the Bible, in Tanakh, that would establish the requirement and the responsibility to set up tziyun kever? So the Gemara says that Rab Brechia, okay, this is a long chagad of names over here. We'll just read the names. Rab Brechia, Rabbi Yaakov Barbas Yaakov, B'Shem Rabbi Chunya, Divras Chavrin, from a place called Divras Chavrin, or Rabbi Yosef Amrilei. He said in the name of Rabbi Yaakov Barach, B'Shem Rabbi Chunya, Divras Chavrin, Rabbi Chizkiah, and Rabbi Uziel Brei, Rabbi Chunya, Debei Chavrin, B'Shem Rabbi Chunya, Debei Chavrin. Okay, fine. We got the list. So where is the basis? Can we find a remez at least for this halacha of tziyun, that we have to make sure in Tumah V'Tara to make markers, to make it obvious that somebody should not be contracting tumah by coming too close to a mess? And the answer is, we find the source for this in the parsha in the Torah of Mitzorah. In Vayikra Yud Gimel, the Torah says, "Vatzaru asher bo hanoga hanega begadav yuprumim v'rosha yaparua ve'al safam yateh v'tamei tamei yikra." Now, what is this v'tamei v'tamei? Like a double language. And the Bavli, actually, in a parallel sugya, Moed Katan, says Tzarchlo diat tzaro l'rabin, that the Mitzorah should notify the people, publicize that he's really suffering as a Mitzorah. But our Gemara learns that Tuma Kora Loch B'Fia V'Yomerz approach, that literally Tamei Tamei Yikra means that the Tumah should cry out, which means that we have to make a simon that people who are passing by should know about the Tumah, and they should be purged from the Tumah. And by analogy, the same thing applies to a corpse and a burial site. Another source for the obligation of Tziyun Kever, by the way, this Gemara is totally oblivious to what's called Kvod HaMes. Today, when we have Hakamas HaMatzeva, Tziyun Kever, it's all about Kvod HaMes and the inscription on the Matzeva and so forth. But this sugya is focused exclusively on the issue of a Tziyun Kever, Tziyun meaning a marker to make sure that people understand that there's Tumah here. Rabbi Ila B'Shem Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman finds a different source from a pasuk in Yechezkel. Now keep in mind that Yechezkel was the great Navi who prophesied with a vision of the future of days. And that's going to take place after Milchemes Gog Magog. And as a result of that Milchama, there are going to be a lot of dead bodies, and the Jewish people will create simonim around the bones of the dead, the skeletons of the dead, as a result of Milchemes Gog Magog. And so the Holchei Drachim, those who are on the road, will be poresh, will be sure to avoid any tumah. And the pasuk says in the 39th chapter of Yechezkel, V'yavru ha'ovrim ba'aretz v'ra'a etzem adamu b'na'at lo tziyun al kivro, etc. that in a place called Gei Hamon Gog, the people passing by will see the bones of a person, of the dead, and they will set up a tzir. And the Gemara now goes through every single word in its pasuk to derive a different halacha about tumas mes. So first, we're going to emphasize the word etzem. Mikan, from this we learn, shemitzainin al hatzamos. In other words, even if the flesh has already disintegrated, all you're left with is a skeleton of bones, nevertheless, we still need to set up a tziyun kever. And the reason for that is because if these atzamos, these bones that we find, fit into one of three categories, then they are metame. One category is called rov binyan hames. If most of the skeleton, most of the structure of the skeleton is still intact. Number two is rov minyan atzamos hames. If most of the bones of the body, even though the structure of the body is not there, and this is 125 bones, or number three, if there's a shear of atzamos called a rova hakav. So in any of those three cases, we have tumas ohel, and therefore we have to make sure that no one is mahil al ames. And basically, in tumas ohel, there are three possibilities of tumas ohel. One is that both the living person and the corpse are under the same ohel. The other possibility is that the corpse is on top of the tahar of the person, or the other way around, the person is mahil al ames, and he is over the mess. Then we go through the pasuk, and it says Adam mikancha mitzainin al hashidra, which means that there's tumas mes and oel mes with the shidra, and that's the skeleton. V'agulgolas, or even if all we have is the skull, they're all metamim, and all these, even though there's no rova kav. Again, if there's rova kav, then that's fine. But we say that suras adam nikeres, if you have a skeleton, and certainly if you have a skull, that's a suras adam, and that's enough to engender tumas oil. And then ubana, the pasuk says that we have to set up a binyan kavua, mikan shemitzainin al gabi even kavua. We should get a very strong, solid stone that's not going to roll around. It's permanently affixed. And on top of that, we'll put thid, the lime, as we discussed, but it's got to be an Evan Kavua. Evan Kavua. Im Omer Ata al Gabi Evan Tluch, because if you were to put some sort of a stone that could move around, like a loose stone, then we're afraid that the stone will roll and will be kicked by the feet of man or the feet of animals. Af hi holechas mitami mokom acher. And as a result, the passers-by are going to get confused because they'll see the stone in a different place, and they'll think that that stone is a stone on top of the dead, when it's really not, because it rolled down the hill. As a result, if they think mistakenly that this stone is a stone that's metame, then they're going to take taros and they're going to be metame taros, and that's litame tara shalo kidin. In other words, we don't want to take something that's tar and declare it tame when it's really tar. And they mistakenly think that there's tumah here, but there's really not. So you need an even kavua, kavua bimkoma. Etzlo, again, back to the pasuk, it says ubana etzlo tziyun. It should have said ubana olav tziyun. What's etzlo? It sounds like the tziyun is next to the corpse, but not on top of the corpse. And this teaches us l'mokom tara, that the tziyun should be set up a little bit at a distance away from the corpse, not on top of the corpse, but in a mokom tara. And the reason for that is because if the tziyun, this marker, would be on top of the mess, then it's very possible that by the time he notices the marker, he's already on top of the mess, on top of the kever. So we want to set up the marker at a distance, so he knows that beyond the marker, that's where the mess is. So the marker he'll stop dead in his tracks. Oh, pardon the pun. He'll freeze in his tracks, and he won't go near the tumah. Now, I don't know if you could help me with this. Why Bisman Hazeh, this halacha apparently fell into oblivion. We put the tziyun directly on top of the corpse. Maybe because our tziyunim are much more obvious. They actually are very bold, they're very large, and they cover the entire area on top of the mess. Tziyun, the last word in this whole pasuk was the word tziyun, mikan l'tziyun. This is the source for the halacha that we require a tziyun in order that people should avoid contact with tumah. Now the Brisa says, "Umotza even achas mitzuyenes," that if you find one stone and you see it's a siman of tumah, afal picha ein mekaimim kain, even though there should not be, if it was done halacha, then ein roy laniach al tziyun al mokum tumah atzma, but nevertheless hamayla le tameh. So that even though if he would have done it right, the tziyun would not be on top of the corpse, and therefore, if he comes in contact with the tziyun, technically he should not be tameh, because the tumah is beyond the tziyun. But nevertheless, we're afraid maybe they didn't do it the right way. They did the way we do it today, and perhaps there is tumah underneath the marker, and therefore we're going to be mitameh. Ani omer, because I'm always afraid umeis mitzuyan v'haya nasun tachtel. Maybe they didn't do it the right way, l'tzayin et hakever, at a distance from the corpse, and therefore the kever and the corpse is exactly underneath the tziyun. Hayushtaim, however, suppose he finds two stones that are covered with lime, and obviously they are markers to tell us about tumah, then hamayil aleim tahar. We're not going to say that there was some sort of mistake over here, and the tumah is directly below the marker, because why did he put two markers? Apparently the fact that there are two markers close to each other means that the kever is in between the two markers, beineim tameh. So if somebody walks between the two stones, he is assumed to have contracted tumah's mess. But if, on the other hand, he's mile on one of these two stones, we are quite sure that in this particular scenario, they did it the right way, and there's no tumah under the stones. However, if let's say he notices that in the space between the two stones, there's harisha, the ground was plowed, then we know for sure that there's no tumah in that spot. Why? Because no one would have the chutzpah to plow an area that has a kever underneath it. So the plowing itself, like you see the ground was plowed, turned over, that proves that there's no corpse in between, in that area that's plowed in between the two markers. Therefore, we view it as if there are two separate markers, and beineim tarsi v'seim tameh. In between them is if you walk in between these two markers, you're tar, because we have proven and substantiated that there's no kever in between the two markers. No one would use an area that had a kever in it for charisha purposes. But on the other hand, we go back to the din of the marker. We say that the marker itself is something because perhaps the mess is underneath the marker. In this case, we're afraid that they buried two corpses in the two markers. Funny, we learned in a brisa, ein mitzayin al habasar. Supposing we have an exactly a kezayis shel basa without any bones, which means that it is metame b'tumitz ohel, but we're not going to set up a marker in this case. And why is that? Because the assumption is that if it's exactly a kezayis, then within a short period of time, relatively, the process of decomposition will take place, and it'll be less than a kezayis. And that's called shema nisakel habasar. Now, what does it mean, Shemen is Hakil Habasa? It means that by the time that he, whoever he might be, was mile on this Evan, maybe by that time already, enough time had elapsed such that the basar, the mess, already went through decomposition. And he's going to mistakenly think that he's Tomei because there's a marker there, and he's going to be Mitami Taros, and that we want to avoid. So the Gemara asks a fine kasha of Yusta Bar Shunem, boy Kume Rabbi Mon. He asks this question in front of Rabbi Mon. Lo Nimta Mitami Taros? Lemafreya. He says, wait a minute. How do you know that enough time has elapsed since the burial of this Kizayas Mitzumtzum of Basar and Ames has elapsed such that it's less than a Kizayas? You're really getting yourself into trouble, assuming, in the absence of a marker, of a tziyun, that he is tar and that there's less than a Kizayas. How do you know? We don't know exactly what date the Kizayas Basar and Ames was buried. We don't know exactly when the disintegration took place. Amalei, so Rabbi Mana says to Yusta, we have to judge and balance two possibilities. One possibility is to say that from now on till the end of days, anyone going here, we put the market down, will be mitame. And then imagine all the taros that were going to be mitame because people came in contact with this marker. The other option is, let's leave out the marker. And in the worst case scenario, there's somebody who may have gone there, and yet it was still a full kizais. It was before disintegration. In the overall balance, we will forego the immediate for the sake of the long term, so that we shouldn't be entering into a situation where we are metame taro shalo kidin. And now we're up to the Mishnah in the middle of Daf Gimel Amid Aleph. The Mishnah says the following. We said that Shluchei Bezdin go out on the 15th of Adar to make sure that the Sados do not have Kelayim in it. Rabbi Yehuda says, Barishon, in the first stage of the Takonot Chachamim that developed sequentially, Oyu Okrim Umashlichim Lefneim. The Shluchei Bezdin, in event that they found, they discovered that there was Kelayim, they would rip out the Kelayim, but leave the growth, the vegetation there, because Kelayim in Torah is mutter ba'no. But Misharabu over Avera, now the situation deteriorated, and more and more people were chas v'shalom getting involved in the violation of Kelayim, and they were very happy, as the Gemara is going to explain, by the fact that the Shluchei Bezdin were ripping out their Kelayim. They were able to get hana from it. Nobody stole the vegetables from their garden after they were pulled out. And as a result, this was nikush. Nikush means when you weed a garden. So ultimately, they benefited from it. Is therefore you mashlichim l'drachim. So when the chutzpah got worse, now the takana was that the Shluchei Bezdin would not only rip out the Kelayim, but they would throw it in the public area and let everyone else take it. Even after this stage, people were still violating the laws of Kelayim. Hiskidu, they made the final takana, sheyu mafkirim es kol asada, that Shluchei Bezdin would establish that the entire field was hefker, and they were mafkir the bailus over the field. The Gemara is going to have a whole discussion about hefker, Bezdin, hefker. Rabbi Yehuda, and so we saw in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Tani, we learned in a Bryce, Rabbi Yehuda, Barishano you okamash lifneim. At the first stage, the Shluchei Bezdin ripped out the Kelayim and they left it there on the field. Smechem shtei smachos. The people were happy and they applauded it for two reasons. First of all, achas shemenakshim sosehem, that as a result of taking out this other min that was growing in the field, that was in some way drawing away the nourishment from the ikar, from the main vegetation. So this was a process of nikush. And viachas, and over two, because the Shluchei Bezin left it there in front of them. There's no Isser Hana, and they would take the kilayim, they would eat it and benefit from it. Bisharabu over Avera, that people started intentionally, deliberately violating these kilayim because they saw it paid off. Sin pays off. Is then Mashlichim al hadrachim. In other words, they would take the produce and put it on the road. Anyone could have access to it, and people would stomp it, and it was lost. Still say it. Although they didn't get any benefit from the kalayim, but at least they benefited from the nikuj. The fact that this other min that was robbing the nourishment from their main min was removed, and the work was done by somebody else, by the shluchei bezdin. Is therefore skinishu mafkirin as kol asadakula. The final takana was that they would be mafkir this. Or asked me, what's the source in the Torah or in Tanakh for the authority of Bezdin to declare someone's private possessions as hefker, as ownerless? The Siv, it says in Ezra declares there was a declaration on the part of Ezra to get together the people, all the people. Now, not that many people came on Aliyah with Ezra, relatively small amount, but there was a lot of intermarriage. And Ezra wanted to get together the people and give them a harangue of musashmus. And in order to make sure that they would come, he gave them 3 days to gather together in a certain place. He said that Yechram Kol Rechusho, anyone who doesn't show up after those 3 days to gather in this major protest rally is Yechram Kol Rechusho v'yibodel mikal hagola. Ezra made a takana that they would be mafkir all his possessions because they violated his word. Now we have a principle called hefker potem min hamasros, and that's derived from a pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. It says uva halevi ki ein lo chelik v'nachla imoch, and we darshan v'yesh lecha v'ein lo, that if you own something and he doesn't, then the Torah says he doesn't have a chelik, therefore give him, let's say, 1/10 of the produce. But if, on the other hand, hefker, which is not yours and it's not his, we're all equal, the Torah doesn't obligate you in maaseh. Now the Gemara wants to know, minayin she p'tur min hamasros. Okay, hefker beis and hefker, but does that mean that it's a full-fledged hefker and the law of hefker potem min hamasros would kick in? Rabbi Yonasan Braid Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Acha Shamaleh. In other words, he derived that Shamaleh here means he was medagde, min hadah. He derived from a brisa in Masechet Sanhedrin. Ein ma'aber in tzashana lo be shvius, full of motzai shvius. We will not add an extra month of Adar through Iber Shana during the Shemitah year, because then the Isra of Avodas Karka will be extended by another month. We're going to postpone Nisan by adding another Adar, and that fattens up the year, extends the year by an extra month with the Isra of Avodas Karka. That's a little bit too much to impose upon the people. And not on the 8th year, because by extending the 8th year, what happens is they are eating the produce of the 6th year because they didn't work in the 7th year, and now you're extending the 8th year. Or that has to do with the Yitzer Chodesh, which we'll see in just a minute. The Imre Brua, but if by chance Bezdin made a mistake and they extended an extra month of Adar, Ma'aber, a year that was either Shvius or Shminis, then it's a valid Ibu. Harezumu Beres. Now all this is a brisa Masechet Sanhedrin, and Rabbi Yonasan now quotes this brisa, and he derives a conclusion from this brisa. And he says the following: the Chodesh Echad Hu Mosif Lo Potem Masrasu. Don't we assume the halacha is that Shvius, Shemitah is Potem in Masros? So if they extended the year of Shvius by another month, then it's going to be Potem in Masros. So you see that Bezdin has the koach, has the authority to pater something in a masros. And Rabbi Yonasan is assuming an equation, an analogy between Iber Shana and Hefker Bezdin Hefker. And in both cases, you put them in a mas. Now, the Gemara takes a little bit of a digression here to try to understand what is the problem of being ma'aber the 8th year? Ad kidon shvius, meaning I could understand not adding an extra month in shvius because then for sure you're extending the avodas karka, the Isra avodas karka for another month. Otzoi shvius, what's the issue about the 8th year? Why not add an extra month the 8th year? Rabbi Ban, Shalol Rabos be Isur Chodesh. Now, Chodesh depends upon the 16th of Nisan. If you add an extra Adar, you're extending the Isur Chodesh for another month. Now, keep in mind that it's the 8th year. People are still eating on the 7th year and going into the 8th year, the produce of the 6th year. And now you're going to add and impose an Isur Chodesh of another month. There's not going to be enough supplies, enough food for everybody. So therefore, we should not be marach. We shouldn't extend the 8th year by adding another month of Isur Chodesh. When supplies and food are at a margin, at a limit. Reb Zera v'Shem Rabbi Lazar, he adds the following. He says, Hadadi at Omar, this thing that you said that we're not ma'aber shvius and shminas, is ad shelo hiter Rebbe. That's only before the heter of Rebbe. In other words, in a period of time before Rebbe was matir, they would not allow the Jewish people to benefit from import from other lands because we're always afraid that, let's say, if they import the vegetables, right? Vegetables grow on the ground, and when you uproot the vegetables, you get what's called a gush offer. Very often you get a piece of the ground that comes up with it. And there was a gzera that gush offer of chutzotz is mitame. As a din of two, we're always afraid that maybe they buried their dead over there, the nations. But Rebbe came along, and at some point he saw that the Jewish people weren't able to maintain this very strict and harsh isur of not importing Yerokos from chutzlaretz, and he was matir Yerokos from chutzlaretz. Aval b'shehita Rebbe lahavi yerek michutzlaretz la'aretz, is then there was an ample supply of food. So what are you worried? You're worried about Iber Shana because there's not enough of a food supply. Well, we can always import food from chutzlaretz. Is there for shvius? He shvius, he shall shari v'eshma. There's no difference between shvius and the rest of the shmita cycle. And if there's a dearth of food, we'll just simply import food from chutzlaretz. Tani, we learned in the Vraisa, ein ma'abrim. We're not going to be ma'aber extend neither the 7th or the 8th year. Omer Abmana hadadi at amrit b'rishona shayu ashanim kitikunam. When the Beis Hamikdash was kayim and we were living, the Jewish people in the land, producing agriculturally, is that was kitikunam achshav she'ein ashanim kitikunam. After the Churban Beis Hamikdash and the Goyim started taking over large tracts of land in Eretz Yisrael, then he shvius, he shar shnei shmur. Then the din of shvius and shminis is like all the other years. You're allowed to be ma'aber them. And the reason for that is we shouldn't be worried about the limited amount of food and supply of ochel because the goyim are now, they're the ones who are selling the food. So our supply of food is coming from goyim. Tari, we learned in the Brisa, Shal Rabban Gamliel, it grew up in Motzai Shvius Miyad. Immediately after the Shemitah year was over, they were ma'aber the 8th year. Why? Because they felt that since you're allowed to import vegetables, etc., food from chutzlaretz, therefore we don't have to be choshesh that by adding an extra month of chadash, v'nisar chadash, that is Hadar Sheni, and pushing off the matir of the Omer, which is the 16th of Nisan, that the people would be suffering. They wouldn't be suffering because they had ample supply of tomech b'chutzla that they imported from chutzla. Rabbi Ovin in Min Hadah. Now we go back to Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Yonasan wanted to say, I'll prove to you that Hefker Bez and Hefker patters you from Maser, from the fact that the Iber Shana also would patter you from Maser. So Rabbi Oven says, in Minadin, if you're proving it from the law of the Iber Shana, less at chamet mino klum, you have no proof whatsoever. Why? Because the source and the basis for the authority of Iber Shana is in the Torah itself. It's not just the Hefker Bez and the Hefker. Or it says, Shamoris Chodesh Aviv, Shomreu Sheyaviu B'chidusha. In other words, because of the discrepancy between the lunar and solar calendars, it would come out that Nisan would not be during the Aviv season. And therefore, the Torah authorized Bezdin and obligated them to be Ma'abra the Shana. And this is to fulfill a mitzvah, say, the Oraisa of Shomer Chodesh Ha'av, Asisa Pesach Hashem Elokecha, to make Pesach in the Aviv. The Gemara now says that once we rejected Rabbi Yonasan, so the question is V'haida Omer Da. So now we're back to square one. What is the source in the Bible for Hefker Bez and Hefker? Or at least prove to me that Hefker Bez and Hefker, we already proved that, but to be Mafkia Maser, it's Potav and a Maser. Do you have a Mishnah or a Brisa or something to support that claim? And the Gemara derives from the Mishnah in the 5th parak of Peah. And this was a knas, a penalty that was imposed on someone who had leket in its field, and instead of letting the aniyim, the poor people, into its field, he piled up his haystacks on top of the leket, so that the aniyim would have no access to the leket. Godish alulukat tachtov, which means that a godish, a haystack, which was placed deliberately on top of the leket, is called anogos ba'aretz hareim shel aniyim. They gave a knas, they imposed a penalty that any kernels that are nogos ba'aretz, even those that weren't leket, the entire ground floor. Imagine it as a gigantic haystack, the whole ground floor, any particular kernel that was stalk that touched the ground was hefker. Shalanim. Any oni could come and take it, even though it wasn't leket. And that was a penalty for what he did.